The scar was still fresh enough to frighten anyone who understood what it meant. A pale, brutal line hidden beneath a pressed shirt while the theater lights warmed his face like a fever. Sir Howard Morrison smiled, as if nothing had happened, as if a surgeon had not opened his chest and rebuilt the roads around his heart only some time before. Somewhere behind the curtain, according to people who later spoke about those uneasy weeks, there were whispers about medication, breathlessness, and whether the great man should even be standing upright for an entire show. If the public had known how recently he had survived a bypass operation, the exact nature of which was never fully disclosed, would they have applauded louder, or demanded that someone take him home? Who decided that the voice of New Zealand still had to perform before the body beneath the dinner jacket had truly healed? Why did the diary keep filling when the heart had already sent its warning? And who, in those velvet corridors of applause and obligation, was most afraid that the truth would be exposed? To understand the shock of that return, you have to understand what Howard Morrison represented to people who had grown up with his grin, his polished shoes, his easy jokes, and that unmistakable voice that could make a hall of strangers feel like one family sitting around the same table. He was not merely a singer. He was a national comfort blanket, a Maori son from Rotorua who had crossed into lounges, clubs, theaters, royal events, charity nights, and television screens with the charm of a man who seemed born under a spotlight. Older fans remembered the Howard Morrison Quartet as if remembering a cheeky secret from youth. The harmonies were bright, the comedy was sharp, and the confidence was almost outrageous for its time. In a country still struggling with its own ideas of class, race, and respectability, Howard could step onto a stage and make the room relax before he had even reached the microphone. That was the glittering version. The version printed on programs, framed in photographs, and retold at dinner parties. The handsome entertainer with the velvet timing. The man who could sing a hymn and make even the skeptics lower their eyes. But behind that easy glow was a punishing machine. Concerts, civic receptions, charity obligations, guest appearances, long drives, late suppers, early flights. The public saw the beau at the end of the night. They did not see the drained face in the mirror afterward, the collar loosened, the hand resting for just a second too long against the chest. By the time his heart crisis struck in 1991, Howard was already carrying more than a performer's schedule. He carried expectation. He carried the pride of Maori achievement in rooms where that pride had once been treated as novelty. He carried the affections of people who believed he belonged to them personally, as if his time, his body, and his strength were communal property. Bypass surgery is not a glamorous phrase. It does not belong with tuxedos, applause, and orchestra introductions. It belongs with white hospital sheets, anxious relatives, tubes, antiseptic air, and the terrifying silence after doctors explain that the heart has been working through danger for far too long. For many ordinary families, such an operation changes everything. The household becomes quieter. Stares become negotiations. Visitors are told not to stay too long. A cup of tea is carried carefully to the chair where the patient sits, pale and humbled, learning that survival is not the same as recovery. Yet Howard was not allowed the luxury of becoming simply a patient in the public imagination. He was Sir Howard, the great entertainer, the man who could not disappoint a packed hall. And according to later accounts, that terrible pressure may have begun closing around him before his chest had even stopped aching. Here is the social contrast that still stings. In the hospital room, he was a vulnerable man in a gown, dependent on nurses, doctors, family, and time. On stage, only weeks and months later, he was expected to become a monument again, glowing beneath the lights while people clapped for the myth and missed the tremor in the flesh. Imagine the backstage corridor, the smell of dust, polish, old curtains, and hot electrical cables. A paper cup of water waiting on a table. A jacket hanging from a peg. Somewhere nearby, people laughing because the audience is settling in and the show must not feel heavy. Then Howard appears. Perhaps slower than before, perhaps careful in the way people are careful when every movement reminds them of pain. He knows how to hide it. Great entertainers always do. They learn early that the audience must never see the price of the gift. And this is where admiration turns into unease, because Howard Morrison's duty to the audience was real, but so was the appetite around him. The halls needed filling. Committees needed a famous name. Promoters needed the reassurance that Sir Howard would appear, shake hands, smile, sing, and prove that everything was fine. Was it loyalty that brought him back so quickly? Or was it a trap built from love, money, and fear? Did he insist, stubborn and proud, that no heart operation could silence him? Or did those around him make it easier for him to say yes than to say no? People who have survived major heart surgery often speak of a strange bargain with the body. You look alive before you feel alive. Your voice returns before your strength does. Your dignity urges you forward while the body whispers, "Not yet." Howard's public image depended on forward motion. He had spent decades turning unease into laughter, tension into music, and rooms full of strangers into believers. To cancel was not merely to miss a date. For a man like him, cancellation could feel like betrayal. That is the cruel part of fame in a small country. Everyone knows you. Everyone has a memory. Everyone has a reason why this one appearance matters. A fundraiser, a civic dinner, a concert promised months ago, a hall where people bought tickets because Howard Morrison meant something sacred to them. But who protects the sacred man from the sacred demand? Who tells the national treasure that he is still made of flesh? Who stands in a doorway and says, "No, not tonight. Not while the stitches are still part of the story"? There are no easy villains in the first act of this tale. Only shadows. A booking calendar that did not seem to blush. A culture that praised toughness until tenderness looked like weakness. A beloved performer who may have believed that resting was selfish. And somewhere in the middle, a heart that had already raised its hand and asked to be heard. The ticking clock began there. Not with a single dramatic collapse, not with a scandal shouted from the front page, but with a quieter horror. A man survives the kind of operation that makes families whisper prayers in hospital corridors, and almost immediately, the world begins asking when he will be useful again. That is why the image of Howard Morrison back on stage after triple bypass surgery is not just inspiring. It is disturbing. Because inspiration can become a disguise for exploitation when the applause is loud enough. His fans saw courage. His colleagues may have seen professionalism. His family, one imagines, saw the cost in the way only families can. In the slow rise from a chair, the careful breath before answering the telephone, the private fatigue after public sparkle. And if the first warning had already come from inside his own chest, why did so many people choose to hear only the music? Only a small circle truly understood how fragile the situation had become, and that is where the story turns colder. Not the crowd in the front row, not the lady clutching a program, not the old friend wiping tears during a favorite song, but the handful of people near the dressing room door, the telephone, the booking diary, and the medical advice. They knew enough to worry, yet the show business machine kept speaking in cheerful practicalities. Can he manage one more? Can the set be shortened? Can the travel be made easier? If the public had seen the anxious glances over his shoulder, the folded notes, the hurried conversations beside half-open doors. The legend of the unstoppable Howard might have cracked right there under the dressing room lights. This was the secret group that gathers around every famous body when the body begins to fail. Some are loving, some are frightened, some are practical to the point of cruelty, and some, according to the darker logic of the entertainment world, convince themselves that keeping the calendar alive is the same as keeping the man alive. Let us be careful, because Howard Morrison's circle included people who loved him deeply, and no honest telling should turn devotion into villainy without proof. But around any star of his scale, there are also handlers, organizers, committee voices, sponsors, and smiling intermediaries who need the performance more than they need the truth. The snake is not always a person. Sometimes the snake wears a neat suit, carries a diary, and says, "Only if you feel up to it," while already knowing the posters are printed. One figure appears again and again in stories like this, though often without a fixed name. The reassuring man at the edge of the room. The one who says he is only helping. The one who tells the family he will keep things light, tells the promoter the star is keen, tells the star the audience would be heartbroken if he stayed away. At first, such a person looks like support. He arranges transport, smooths over awkward calls, protects the star from minor annoyances. He becomes useful, then necessary, then almost invisible. But usefulness can curdle into pressure. A diary can become a leash. And when a recovering heart patient is surrounded by people praising his bravery, the most dangerous sentence in the room may be the gentle one. You do not want to let them down. Howard had spent his life defeating expectation with charm. In the early days, when the quartet was making audiences laugh with fearless parody and silky harmony, he learned that a performer could control a room by refusing to show fear. New Zealand entertainment was not soft ground for a Maori artist with ambition. Every triumph had to be earned twice, once with talent and again with composure. The public loved the laughter, but the laughter was also armor. Howard's wit could diffuse prejudice before it had time to settle. His elegance could make institutions welcome him while pretending they had always been welcoming. His success became a story the nation liked telling about itself. Yet, stories that nations like telling can trap the people inside them. Once Howard became proof of generosity, unity, and good humor, he could not easily be tired, angry, afraid, or ill. The symbol had to stay polished, because too many people had hung their comfort on his shine. After the operation, that shine became almost unbearable to maintain. Think of the backstage mirror again. A face known across the country, looking back at itself. A comb, a bow tie, a shirt carefully chosen to conceal what no audience came to see. The body remembers what the poster forgets. The chest remembers the opening, the repair, the shock. The lungs remember the first difficult breaths after surgery. The muscles remember weakness, even when the mouth has begun to joke again. But the crowd does not want weakness. The crowd wants return. And when the curtain rises, it is astonishing how quickly concern becomes consumption. People clap because they are relieved. They clap because they are grateful. They clap because they believe applause is medicine. For Howard, perhaps it was medicine for a while. There are performers who feel more alive on stage than in any hospital room. The lights warm them, the music lifts them, the gaze of the audience turns pain into purpose. But medicine can become poison if the dose is wrong. One show becomes another. A shortened appearance becomes a full evening. A careful return becomes proof that he is fine. And once the myth of recovery takes hold, anyone who asks for caution risks sounding like a spoil sport at a celebration. That is the horror hidden inside the ovation. The very love that surrounded him may have made it harder for him to rest. Who wants to be the person who tells a hall of devoted older fans that their hero is too fragile to come out? New Zealand adored him not only because he sang, but because he seemed to belong to every gathering. He could stand before governors, elders, television hosts, church audiences, and soldiers of nostalgia, and somehow make each group feel personally honored. That gift built him a career. It also built a cage. The cage had velvet bars, awards, invitations, honor, duty, a title before his name, smiling photographs with dignitaries, handshakes that lasted too long because everyone wanted a piece of the warmth. Inside that cage, the medical truth had to compete with the public hunger for reassurance. Bypass surgery says, slow down. Show business says, prove you are back. Family says, please be careful. Pride says, I have survived worse. And Howard had survived much. He had come from Rotorua, from community, from music, from a time when Maori excellence was too often treated as entertainment before it was treated as authority. He had turned himself into a national institution without losing the flavor of the marae, the humor of the people, the groundedness that made his elegance feel human. That background matters because it explains why stopping was not simple. For some stars, rest is an inconvenience. For Howard, rest may have felt like silence at the very moment his people, his audience, and his own pride expected song. The secret group around him, whether formal or accidental, may have believed they were protecting the legend. They may have thought carefully managed appearances would keep his spirits high. They may have told themselves that he was a grown man making his own choices. But there is a difference between choice and pressure when everyone in the room benefits from your yes. There is a difference between encouragement and quiet coercion when posters, tickets, reputations, and expectations are already lined up like witnesses. This is where the image darkens. A beloved man is recovering from a major operation. The nation sees a comeback. Behind the comeback, according to accounts and the grim patterns of celebrity life, there may have been a private negotiation no audience was allowed to hear. How much could he sing? How far could he travel? How many hands could he shake before exhaustion showed? Who had the courage to count the cost, and who preferred to count the seats? The most chilling secrets in entertainment are rarely shouted. They are murmured in practical tones. He will be all right if we keep it brief. He wants to do it. The audience needs him. We cannot cancel now. Those sentences sound harmless until you place them beside a healing chest. Then they begin to feel like fingerprints. Not evidence in a courtroom, perhaps, but marks left on a life by a system that called its appetite devotion. Howard's brilliance made the deception easier. A lesser performer might have looked ill. He knew how to enter a room. He knew how to brighten the voice, how to time the smile, how to make a joke land before anyone noticed the effort behind it. That is the terrifying skill of a seasoned entertainer. He can hide a storm inside a song. He can make the audience feel protected, while he himself is the one in need of protection. He can turn frailty into grace so smoothly that even those who love him may underestimate the danger. And if a small group knew the true state of his recovery, if they saw the pain in the pauses and the fatigue after the handshakes, why did the public story remain so clean, so triumphant, so convenient? The visitor came quietly, according to a story repeated in the half-light of memory, not as a villain in a black coat, but as the kind of respectable caller who never needs to raise his voice. He arrived near a dressing room before one of those post-surgery appearances, when the air already smelled of pressed wool, face powder, and old theater dust. Howard, people later suggested, had been conserving his energy, sitting still, speaking softly, saving the famous brightness for the crowd beyond the wall. Then the door closed, the conversation lowered, and something in the room changed. Was it a plea? A reminder? A business matter? Or a carefully wrapped guilt trip? And if the public had known that a recovering heart patient was being visited not only by love, but by expectation wearing polished shoes, would they have let the curtain rise? No one should pretend we can reconstruct every private exchange. The dead years keep their secrets, and respectable people learn early how to make pressure sound like concern. But every great comeback has a moment before it becomes public. A moment when one person says something that tips the exhausted star toward the stage. For Howard Morrison, that moment is the one we must imagine with care. Not because imagination is proof, but because the official surface is too smooth to explain the ache beneath it. A man does not return from triple bypass surgery into demanding public life without 1,000 little nudges, some tender, some selfish, some impossible to separate. The fatal visitor in this part of the story may not be one individual at all. It may be the caller on the telephone, the organizer at the door, the old friend saying, "The people need you," the committee member reminding him that everyone has worked so hard. Still, stories cling to faces, and in the tabloid darkness, there is always that one shadow in the corridor. A figure who seems to steady the star while quietly steering him. A person who knows which words will reach the pride before the caution can answer. Howard's pride was not vanity in the cheap sense. It was forged from discipline, from community expectation, from decades of being required to be charming even when the room was not kind. He had learned that dignity could be a weapon, and he wielded it beautifully. But after surgery, dignity can become dangerous. The recovering patient does not want to be fussed over. The famous man does not want to appear diminished. The knight does not want to look fragile in front of people who have come to celebrate his strength. So when someone says, "Just come and say a few words," the trap is already set. A few words become a song becomes an encore becomes proof of recovery. The audience would have seen only magic, the old command of timing, the generous smile. The voice, perhaps altered by age and ordeal, but still carrying that emotional authority that made people feel they were in the presence of someone larger than ordinary life. In front of them, Howard could transform. The shoulders lift, the eyes brighten, the hand finds the microphone. The room leans in, and suddenly the man who had been privately rationing breath becomes the legend again. That transformation is why performers are worshipped. It is also why they are endangered. Because the public mistakes transformation for health. They see the flame and forget that something is burning. At home, the story would have been different. The jacket comes off, the laughter drains away. The silence after applause is one of the loneliest sounds on earth, especially for a man whose body has just been through war. A home after major surgery has its own rhythm. Pills arranged with care, chairs placed where rising is easier. Family voices lowered, not because there is nothing to say, but because everyone is listening for signs of strain. There may have been private arguments, the kind every family knows when love meets stubbornness. "Please rest. I am fine. You are not fine. They are expecting me. Let someone else do it. There is no one else." That last sentence is the curse of the beloved entertainer. There is no one else. Not because nobody else can sing, but because nobody else can be Howard Morrison to the people waiting outside. The public image demanded abundance. The private body demanded mercy. Between the two stood a man trained to give more than he admitted he had. And let us not forget the old show business habit of turning suffering into proof of greatness. The artist who performs through pain becomes a legend. The artist who cancels becomes a problem. The artist who rests becomes a rumor. If Howard had withdrawn fully, would whispers have started? Was he finished? Had the surgery changed him? Could the old magic survive? Those questions, even unspoken, can wound a proud performer more deeply than critics ever could. So, the secret visitor, real or symbolic, did not need to threaten him. He only needed to place the burden back into Howard's hands. The people are waiting. The hall is full. It would mean so much. That is how a demand disguises itself as affection. It kneels before the star while quietly tightening the chain. It says, "We love you," and then asks for proof. For viewers who have lived through heart surgery in their own families, this is the part that feels almost unbearable. You know the look of someone pretending to be stronger than they are. You know how a loved one can sit upright and smile for visitors, then collapse into exhaustion when the door closes. Now place that fragile performance before an audience. Add microphones, travel, expectation, and national affection. Add the pride of a man who has never wanted to seem weak. What emerges is not a simple comeback story. It is a moral question wearing a sequined jacket. How much of a performer belongs to the crowd, and how much must be rescued from the crowd before love becomes consumption? Howard Morrison's return after triple bypass surgery can be told as courage, and it was courage. But courage is not always pure. Sometimes courage is what a trapped person calls the only option left. As the 1990s moved forward, the public would continue to celebrate him, and rightly so. His place in New Zealand entertainment was secure. His voice and persona had already crossed generations. Yet once you know about the operation, every later appearance carries a second image beneath it. Not just the singer in the light, but the patient in recovery. Not just the applause, but the heartbeat underneath it, working, warning, refusing to be ignored. That heartbeat is the ticking clock in this story. It does not shout. It does not interrupt the orchestra. It waits behind the ribs while everyone else talks about bookings, honors, memories, and the next event. And the most dangerous thing about a ticking clock is that people can get used to the sound. They can build a whole career around pretending not to hear it. They can clap over it. So when Howard walked back into the light, was it a victory over illness, or the beginning of a longer, quieter bargain that no heart, however brave, should ever have been forced to make? There are people who sense disaster before it arrives, and Howard Morrison, according to those who knew him longest, was one of them. He kept a small green stone pendant close during the years that mattered most, a piece worn smooth by handling, touched before curtain calls the way a sailor touches a compass in rough weather. Those near him in the later touring years noticed that when the pendant was left behind in a hotel room or packed into the wrong bag, Howard grew quieter, stilled himself in a particular way, as if listening for something ordinary ears could not catch. One member of his road company later said that on the worst nights, the nights when Howard seemed to be carrying something heavier than the set list, the greenstone was nowhere visible. What did a man who had survived the opening of his own chest come to believe about luck, about signs, about the body's silent negotiations with time? And was there a night when the old talisman failed to travel with him, and the performance that followed left people in the wings genuinely afraid? Superstition is not weakness in a performer. It is the private religion of a person who has stood in enough uncertain rooms to know that talent alone cannot explain why some nights ignite and others go cold. Howard Morrison had been working stages since the 1950s, and in all those decades he had accumulated the rituals of survival. A particular order for dressing, a specific warmth required backstage, certain silences respected before the first note. These were not the eccentricities of a difficult star. They were the quiet architecture of a man who understood that the gap between a great show and a disaster was narrower than any audience ever imagined. After the heart attack of 1991 and the bypass surgery that followed in the years before 1995, those rituals carried additional weight. The body had been tested and repaired, and the man inside it knew something now that the posters on the walls could never know. He knew the sound of his own mortality at close range. He knew what it meant when a chest tightened unexpectedly, when a breath arrived late, when the legs felt heavier than they should at the bottom of a short staircase. And so the small green pendant, the particular order, the backstage silence, these things became not merely habit, but negotiation. A private treaty with whatever force decides which performances end in applause and which end in ambulances. People around him noticed the change in the quality of his stillness. Before the surgery, Howard's composure had been active, almost performative itself, the composure of a man too busy and too confident to waste energy on doubt. After the surgery, the stillness was different, deeper, more considered, as if he were perpetually taking stock of some internal report that no one else was permitted to read. His long-time audiences noticed nothing, of course. That was the genius of the craft. The transformation at the microphone remained complete. The voice carried its authority. The timing held its precision. The room still tilted toward him when he smiled, the way rooms had been tilting toward Howard Morrison since the four young men from Rotorua first made New Zealand fall sideways with laughter and harmony. But the people who handed him water between songs, who stood in the wings counting the seconds between his phrases, who drove him home in the car after the event ended and the adrenaline withdrew, those people knew the performance of health for what it was. A performance. And the question that haunted the careful observer was always the same. How long can a man perform recovery before recovery stops being a performance and becomes something else entirely? There is a particular cruelty in the way fame isolates its subjects from ordinary sympathy. When a neighbor recovers from bypass surgery, the street rallies. Casseroles appear at the door. Visitors are managed. Rest is enforced by affection. The neighborhood conspires, gently and without drama, to make slowness acceptable. Howard had no such neighborhood. He had a nation, and a nation cannot bring casseroles. A nation can only express its love in the form of demand. Come out, be seen, sing, remind us you are still here. The very scale of the affection made privacy impossible, and privacy, after major cardiac surgery, is not a luxury. It is medicine. This is the part of the story that requires honesty about what surrounds every national treasure, however kind the intentions. There were people close to Howard who loved him without qualification. There were also people whose affection was inseparable from his usefulness. Not villains, but a particular category of the devoted who had organized their own sense of purpose around his continued performance. For these people, Howard resting was not simply inconvenient, it was disorienting. It raised questions they preferred not to face. And so the machinery of encouragement and obligation began to operate again, quietly, practically, in pleasant tones that sounded nothing like pressure, because pressure, when it wears the clothes of care, rarely announces itself by name. Was there a specific figure? Sources who spoke over the years about the inner circle of Howard's working life describe someone, and here we follow the cautious language of people who understood what they were implying, who was always present at the practical conversations. Not a manager in the formal sense, not family, but the kind of indispensable presence that accumulates around famous people, because famous people need someone to handle what they cannot handle themselves. This person, whoever they were, in whatever combination of faces and roles, spoke the language of Howard's pride fluently. Not commands, not ultimatums, Simply the steady reminder that Howard was needed, that no one else could fill the particular shape of his absence, that the audience was not merely a crowd, but a community of older New Zealanders for whom one more evening with Sir Howard was not entertainment, but something closer to communion. And Howard, raised in the Maori tradition of service, shaped by decades of understanding that his talent was also an obligation, would have heard that language and felt it land in the place where stubbornness and love sit side by side and look nearly identical. Here is a night worth imagining, drawn from the pattern of accounts rather than any single sworn testimony. A regional hall somewhere in the North Island, the kind of venue with good curtains and difficult acoustics, full of people in their best clothes because Sir Howard is coming. Outside, a car arrives early. Inside the building, in a room that smells of instant coffee and old carpet, Howard sits in a chair that has been placed carefully near the door so he does not have to walk far. He is wearing the jacket, but not the tie yet. The tie comes later, when the tie is a signal that the private man has stepped aside for the public one. Someone has placed a cup of tea within reach. There are voices in the corridor, the ordinary busy voices of people setting up chairs and testing microphones and solving the small emergencies of live performance. Then the door opens and the particular figure enters, the one who always seems to arrive at the moment when resolution is still possible. There is conversation, and it is warm, as it always is, because warmth is the medium through which this kind of pressure travels most efficiently. The audience numbers are mentioned, the distance some people have driven, the specific elderly couple in the front row who wrote a letter to say that this concert was the thing they had looked forward to for 3 months. None of this is a threat. All of it is a weight. Howard picks up the tie. The performance begins not at the microphone, but here, in this carpeted room, with this small gesture of surrender to the life the public had decided he should be living. And somewhere in the building, the instant coffee goes cold, and the audience begins to applaud before he has even reached the stage, because the compere has said his name, and the name alone is already music to people who grew up with it. What did Howard feel walking out into that warmth? Gratitude, almost certainly. Something like love, because the connection between Howard Morrison and his audience was genuine, not manufactured, not cynical, earned over 40 years of showing up and meaning it. But underneath the gratitude, was there also the particular exhaustion of a man who has been given no acceptable way to say enough? The question that his story keeps asking is not whether Howard was brave, he was, without question, but whether bravery was the only option made available to him. And that is a question worth sitting with, because the answer tells us something uncomfortable about what we do to the people we love most publicly. By the middle years of his career, long before the heart crisis of 1991, Howard Morrison had become something that New Zealand rarely acknowledged producing. A genuine celebrity in the full, complicated, consuming sense of the word. Not just famous, not just respected. Famous in the way that colonizes a person, that makes strangers feel entitled to a piece of something that was never theirs to begin with. The Howard Morrison Quartet had broken into national consciousness with a combination of musical ability and comedic nerve that was almost startling for its era. Their parody recordings were played until the grooves wore thin. Their television appearances generated the kind of collective excitement that later generations would only experience through imported American programming. They were local and brilliant and funny in specifically New Zealand ways, which made them feel like a gift the country had given itself. For Howard personally, that early success carried a private complexity that the stage persona carefully concealed. He was a Maori man achieving mainstream fame in a country whose mainstream still contained significant ambivalence about what Maori excellence was supposed to look like. The smile and the charm were real, but they were also strategic, and strategy requires energy. Holding a room that would prefer to treat you as entertainment rather than authority requires a constant, disciplined performance of approachability that leaves very little room for authentic weakness. The racial arithmetic of his career has been discussed with increasing honesty in the years since his passing, and it is essential to the medical story, not tangential to it. Because a man who has spent decades performing composure in rooms where composure was a form of survival does not easily set down that performance when the body begins to ask him to. The instinct goes too deep. The habit is too ingrained. The cost of appearing fragile for a man of Howard's background and position was calculated in a currency that younger, whiter, more protected artists would never have needed to consider. This is not speculation. It is the pattern of an entire era. Maori performers of Howard's generation operated with a double awareness. One part of them engaging fully with the warmth and the music, another part monitoring the room for the subtle shifts that told them whether they were being celebrated or merely tolerated. That vigilance is exhausting, even in good health. After triple bypass surgery, it is an additional load on a system already stressed to its limit. The television work compounded everything. By the time New Zealand television had fully established itself as the nation's living room, Howard was one of its most comfortable inhabitants. He appeared with a naturalness that made the medium seem easy, the kind of ease that only arrives after thousands of hours of difficult work have been so thoroughly absorbed that they no longer look like work at all. But television has a particular relationship with the body of its subjects. It flattens fatigue. It cannot smell the dressing room. It cannot hear the breath between phrases. It presents a Howard Morrison in full color and warm sound and asks viewers to decide that this is what the man really is, that this rectangle of light contains the whole truth. When Howard appeared on television screens after his surgery, the nation saw reassurance. The glasses, the smile, the unhurried delivery of a man who had always seemed to have all the time in the world. Viewers called each other. "Did you see Howard? He looked wonderful. He is marvelous. He will outlast all of us." And those calls, those warm judgments delivered across the country's telephone lines, landed back in the ears of the people who booked his appearances as confirmation. The public was satisfied. The public was not asking for his rest. The public was asking for more. The honors system added its own quiet pressure. A knighthood is a beautiful thing, and Sir Howard Morrison wore his with a dignity that suited him entirely. But a knighthood is also a statement about public obligation. It is the nation saying, formally and permanently, "You belong to us." Your time has value to the collective. Your presence at civic events is not merely welcome, but expected. So when Sir Howard recovered from an operation that would have excused any private citizen from public life for the better part of a year, the knighthood sat quietly in the background of every conversation about his calendar, not as a demand, but as a context. The context that said, this man's life has always belonged partly to others, and that arrangement does not pause for the inconvenience of illness. There were royal events. There were national commemorations. There were charity functions for causes that depended on the fundraising power of a famous face. Howard had given himself to these obligations freely and generously for decades, and there is no suggestion that he resented them. But freely given obligations accumulate. After enough years, freely given begins to look and feel like simply given, and the freedom in the original choice becomes difficult to locate. His family watched all of this from a position that only family occupies, close enough to see the whole person, including the parts the public never sees, and simultaneously too close to be heard as neutral observers when the argument about rest turned serious. Families of people like Howard learn a particular kind of silence. They learn when to stop arguing, because the argument changes nothing, because the man at the center of it has made his decision, and the decision was made not in a moment of stubbornness, but in the long accumulation of a life organized around showing up. You cannot unpick that in a conversation, however loving, however frightened. You can only be present for the aftermath, and hope the aftermath is manageable. There were children who wanted more of him. There was a domestic life that existed in the gaps between the public one. There were ordinary days, ordinary meals, ordinary silences that no one writes about because ordinary is not what the audience pays for. After the surgery, those ordinary days would have carried an altered quality. The ordinary pleasure of a morning without obligation becomes more vivid after you have spent time in a hospital bed wondering about mornings. The small domestic moments, a garden in decent weather, a familiar chair, a radio playing something quiet, become briefly and acutely precious when the chest reminds you that nothing is permanent. How long did he have with those moments before the calendar reasserted itself? How many weeks of genuine stillness before the telephone began its patient campaign? People who cared for Howard in those post-surgery months, whether professionally or personally, have left only fragments in the public record, and those fragments are carefully worded in the way that fragments left by decent people always are. Nobody says he was pushed. Nobody names the pressure as cruelty. The language is always softer, more ambiguous. The language of a country that prefers its stories heroic. But the heroic story and the honest story are not always the same story. The heroic story says he refused to be defeated. The honest story might say the conditions that surrounded his recovery made defeat, in the form of real, extended rest, practically impossible for a man of his character, background, and obligations. Both things can be true simultaneously, and the discomfort of holding them both is exactly the discomfort this part of Howard Morrison's life deserves to generate. Because if he had been someone else, someone without the particular weight of national significance, without the racialized pressure of performing health as a form of dignity, without the accumulated obligations of a knighthood and a career built on showing up, would he have been back on that stage so soon? Or would he have been allowed the ordinary mercy of recovery? That is a question that does not flatter the entertainment system, the booking culture, the honor system, or the particular brand of national love that consumes its objects while insisting it is only celebrating them. And if you have ever watched someone you love return to obligation before they were ready, driven by pride and duty and the terrifying belief that the world cannot manage without them, then you already know what the people who loved Howard Morrison felt standing in those wings, watching the lights find him, watching the room rise toward him, watching the man perform abundance while the body beneath the jacket quietly negotiated a more difficult arithmetic. The applause was real. The love was real. The cost was real. All three were real at the same time, in the same hall, on the same night. And that is precisely why the story will not simplify, no matter how many times it is told as triumph. Did the people who filled those halls ever ask themselves what it cost him to stand there for their comfort, and whether their comfort was worth that price? There was a woman who worked backstage at a series of Howard Morrison engagements through the 90s touring years, a dresser and stage assistant, whose particular job placed her in the intimate geography of the wings, where performers shed the show the moment the curtain closes and become human again in the space of 10 steps. She handled the jacket between numbers, refilled the water glass, and stood in the particular silence that settles backstage when a performer is gathering themselves for one more push into the light. For more than a decade after Howard Morrison's passing, she said almost nothing publicly, held in check by the loyalty that people who work close to famous lives absorb almost without noticing, a loyalty that feels like respect but functions like a lock. When her account eventually began to circulate, carefully and in fragments, among the regional theater community that had watched Howard perform across 4 decades, it did not arrive as accusation. It arrived as grief. Because what she described was not scandal in any sensational sense. It was the quiet, undeniable portrait of a man performing health to an audience that needed to believe in it, while the body beneath the performance told a story the spotlight was never permitted to illuminate. She described a particular quality of stillness that Howard maintained between numbers in the post-surgery touring years. Not the stillness of a man resting, but the stillness of a man conserving. A careful economy of movement that a performer in full health would not have recognized as significant, but that anyone who has stood close to someone managing cardiac recovery would identify instantly as the specific vigilance of a body monitoring its own reports. He would stand just off stage and breathe in a way that was deliberate and inward. Each breath counted, and each exhale a small act of discipline. He would press his right hand briefly against his ribs, not the theatrical gesture of a singer preparing for an emotional number, but something smaller and more private. A check. A question put to the body in the only language available to it. She also described the makeup, not the ordinary stage foundation every performer requires under hot lights, but additional work done in the dressing room before each show, covering things that she understood. Without it ever being explained to her directly, the audience was not supposed to see. A grayness to the skin on the difficult nights, a puffiness around the eyes after long travel that took longer than it should to resolve. There were nights, she said, when Howard arrived at a venue looking like a man who had not slept properly in weeks, and left the dressing room looking like the image on the poster nailed to the outside door. The transformation was genuine craft, assembled by skilled people whose professional function was not to reflect the truth of how he was, but to project the truth of how he was required to be. She was not the only one who noticed. Another member of the touring company, a sound technician who worked several of the same engagements and who heard things from a position close to the technical reality of how Howard's voice was performing night to night, described a similar pattern of private concern, conducted entirely in silence. The voice itself had changed in a particular way across the course of an evening's show in the later touring years. Not in its quality. The quality remained, and remained extraordinary, but in its economy. Howard had become, this technician said, a conservationist of his own voice in a way he had not needed to be in the earlier decades. He chose the moments when he would project fully, with the precision of a man who understood that the reserve was finite and the show was long. The lights would find him, and the room would rise toward him with that sound, that particular, collective, wordless sound that a hall makes when it recognizes someone it loves. And Howard Morrison would become, once again, the thing the poster had promised. The voice carrying its old authority, the timing still precise, the connection with the audience immediate and real. Because Howard's feeling for the people watching him was never manufactured. That was always genuine, even on the hard nights, especially on the hard nights. It was the one thing that no amount of physical strain could hollow out, and it was also the thing that meant the asking never quite stopped. But between songs, in those brief intervals when the applause was fading and the next number had not yet begun, she could see the reality beneath the show. The hand against the ribs, the measured breath. The eyes doing something quite different from what the face was doing. She never asked him about it directly. That is not how the relationship between backstage staff and performers operates, even in the most caring of professional arrangements. You see what you see, and you keep it in the private place where discretion stores its most important contents. You hand him the water. You straighten the jacket. You make the next 20 seconds as smooth as possible. And you do not bring what you have witnessed into the conversation he is saving his breath to have with the crowd. There was one night she described more specifically than the others. A coastal venue, a packed house, a set that ran longer than scheduled because the audience kept calling for more, and Howard, as was always the case, found it impossible to walk away while people were still asking. By the time he came off stage that night, she said, he was leaning in a way that was not quite right. Not dramatically, not in any way visible from the 10th row, but in the way a man leans when the body is filing a report that the mind has decided to defer until later. She got him to the chair. She handed him the water without being asked. He sat and said nothing for a short while, which was unusual for him because Howard Morrison was almost never silent in company. And then he looked up at her with an expression she had seen on the hardest nights. Not quite a smile, not quite an apology, something between the two, and said quietly that a few more minutes and they would both be fine. Whether he meant himself or the evening or something larger that neither of them could name, she never quite worked out. But she thought about those words for a long time afterward. What haunts her most is not what he said, but what she did not say in return. Because what, honestly, could she have said to a man who had long since decided that a few more minutes was always going to be enough? She spoke about him the way people speak about someone they were not able to help, not because they lacked the will, but because the architecture of the situation had removed the mechanism. There was no procedure for a backstage dresser to stop a show. There was no conversation to have that the professional world around her would have validated or supported. What she had was the view from the wings, and the 30 seconds between numbers when she could see what the front of the house could not. And she carried that view for many years in the careful silence of someone who understands both the weight of what they witnessed and the limits of what they were positioned to do about it. What did Howard say on the nights when the distance between the man in the wings and the man on the stage was widest? And was there anyone in that dressing room who ever found the words to tell him he had already given enough? There was a specific hotel in Hamilton whose duty manager, speaking some years after Howard Morrison's passing, described a set of repeat guest arrangements quite unlike anything else in his 15 years in the hospitality industry. Sir Howard had a preferred room when the touring circuit brought him through that city. Not the largest, not the most expensive, but a particular ground-floor corner room that required no stairs, had a side entrance bypassing the lobby, and a bathroom suited to a morning routine that a member of the touring party had quietly asked, at their first visit, the management to accommodate without drawing staff attention. The requests were entirely reasonable. The privacy was understandable for a man of Howard's public profile, but the manager later said that the way those requests were delivered, in the tone of someone long accustomed to managing a serious reality that was being kept carefully separate from the public version of events, had remained with him in a way that other professional dealings had not. Hotel rooms are the private diaries of touring lives. They absorb what the stage refuses to hold. The exhaustion that no audience is permitted to see gathers in a hotel room with a particular weight, and the objects in those rooms, the medication on the bedside table, the arrangement of the pillows, the glass of water placed within precise reaching distance of where the occupant will sleep, compose a portrait that no concert program has ever included. Howard Morrison's hotel rooms in the 90s touring years were, by the accounts of those who had legitimate reasons to be in them, the rooms of a man who had constructed an exacting daily architecture around the requirements of a body functioning under significant post-surgical conditions, while maintaining a public schedule that would have challenged a man 20 years younger in full health. The medication was organized with the thoroughness of someone who had learned, through instruction or experience, or both, that the margin between a manageable night and a very difficult one lived in a small daily routine performed without exception. There was a notebook, practical rather than personal, the kind of record a careful patient keeps at a doctor's request, that tracked the daily pattern of how he was feeling, the numbers that mattered to his cardiac care, and the observations his physicians had asked him to maintain. This notebook sat alongside the other notebook, the one with set lists and running orders, and the occasional lyric written out in full, because the mind after major surgery does not always retrieve its contents with the same automatic ease it once had. And Howard had long since decided that preparation was not weakness, but professionalism. There was also a card, small, kept in the inside breast pocket of whatever jacket he was wearing on any given evening, containing medical information in the compact language of clinical instruction, conditions, medications, the names of his cardiologist and personal physician, and a description of what first responders would need to know immediately if they were called to assist him in a situation where he himself could not speak. He had arranged for this card to be made, and he carried it without exception. The people who knew of the card were not many. The people who understood what it meant, who grasped that its presence in his pocket was the private acknowledgement of a risk the booking calendar mentioned nowhere, were fewer still. This is the double life behind the Howard Morrison story. Not a hidden address, not a concealed dependency, not the lurid secret that dramatic language usually promises, but something in its own way more searching. The hidden reality was simply the full and honest account of his physical condition, carried in his pocket and arranged on his bedside table each night, while the public version of events continued, cheerfully and without qualification, to describe a recovered entertainer available for booking. What some have called a betrayal, and that word is used carefully here, not to condemn any individual, but to name what occurs when a system may fail a person, was not in Howard's preparations. Howard's preparations showed a man who understood his situation with absolute clarity. It was, some would argue, in the gap between what the card in his pocket implied about the real risk of each performance and what the contracts surrounding that pocket may have continued to require of him regardless. There was one evening, placed by those who have spoken about it somewhere in the middle 90s and deliberately left without a specific date out of consideration for people still living, when Howard was in his hotel room between the afternoon sound check and the evening show and was not well. The phrase, "not well," used in the understated New Zealand way that sometimes employs the minimum of syllables for a situation requiring considerably more, was the description used by those who were there or nearby. Someone in the touring party was aware. A discussion took place behind a closed door. The options were considered: cancellation, a call to medical services, a longer rest and reassessment. The option that prevailed, according to those who have spoken about it, was the shortest rest the situation could reasonably be said to permit, an assessment that Howard appeared to be finding his steadiness and the decision to proceed. He walked out onto that stage and delivered a full performance. The audience knew nothing. They clapped and laughed and were moved in the ways they always were. They had no idea that the decision about whether to open the theater or call an ambulance had been made approximately 90 minutes before the curtain rose. And whoever made that call, the voice, if there was one, that said, "He will be fine and the show will go on," has never been asked about it publicly, in any forum, in any form. The touring party that made that decision, or acquiesced in it, or failed to make the alternative, were not callous people. They cared about Howard. Professional years in close proximity had generated genuine attachment. But caring about someone and protecting them are not always the same activity, particularly when the person at the center of both the caring and the not quite protecting is a man whose entire professional identity is built on forward motion. It is very difficult to stop a man whose deepest self believes that stopping is the same as failing. It is harder still when the systems surrounding him are organized to interpret his willingness to continue as evidence that continuing is appropriate. Who made that call, and what precisely were they weighing when they made it? In the filing system of a management office that no longer operates under its original name, there are said to be booking contracts from the post-surgery years of Howard Morrison's career, documents that are, on their printed surface, entirely standard instruments of the entertainment industry. Performance fees, venue requirements, travel and accommodation provisions. cancellation terms expressed in the measured legal language that the business of live performance uses to translate human presence into enforceable commercial obligation. Any entertainment lawyer reviewing these documents would find nothing unusual in their form. Any cardiologist who understood what the performance schedules they described meant for a man managing the aftermath of triple bypass surgery on the New Zealand regional touring circuit would find them deeply troubling in their implications. The cancellation clauses demand the most careful examination. A cancellation clause in a contract with any performer is a financial instrument. It describes the monetary consequences of non-appearance and protects the investment of people whose livelihoods depend on the performance taking place. In ordinary circumstances, it is a reasonable thing. But a cancellation clause in a contract with a man in Howard Morrison's post-surgery condition was not operating in ordinary circumstances. It was placing a monetary cost on the act of following medical advice. It was making the decision to rest, the decision his cardiologist had written in careful terms on discharge summaries more than once across the 90s, into a decision that carried professional and financial consequences for people beyond himself, people he knew, people whose difficulty if he did not appear was entirely real. A man of Howard Morrison's character did not need to be threatened. He did not need a cancellation clause invoked or enforced or waved in front of him explicitly. He simply needed to know it existed. The knowledge that not showing up created hardship for a chain of people who had built their commitments around his name, some old friends, some small provincial venues where a Howard Morrison concert was one of the few major events of the calendar year, some charities whose fundraising depended entirely on his drawing power, was enough. It operated through the same channel as every other obligation that had shaped his career, the channel connecting his pride to his loyalty, which had never once been successfully blocked by any argument, however loving or however medically rational. There were said to be attempts, according to those who observed the management conversations of those years, to introduce contract provisions acknowledging the specific circumstances of Howard's health, language that would allow medical cancellation without the same financial and professional weight that other forms of non-appearance carried. Whether those attempts succeeded, and to what degree, is not fully clear from what has been made available. What is clear is that Howard continued to perform on schedules his post-surgical condition should not have been required to sustain, and that the diary remained full enough to make genuine rest a recurring battle rather than an established right. The regional circuit that had carried Howard's career for decades felt the change without entirely naming it. Promoters noticed that availability was different, though the same professional warmth accompanied every conversation. Organizers, who had once been able to count on 6 or 8 appearances in a touring block, found themselves planning around 2 or 3. Nobody complained publicly, because nobody wanted to be the person who suggested that Sir Howard Morrison was not performing enough, when he had already given more than almost any comparable entertainer in the country's history. But the adjustment was understood, in the quiet way that industries understand the late career recalibrations of their most significant figures, as a renegotiation that everyone agrees to without anyone formally signing anything. Somewhere around the latter half of the 90s, something shifted in the texture of his public engagements. The people who had watched the circuit over many years describe a gradual recalibration, not a dramatic announcement, but a careful reduction in the most physically demanding elements of the calendar. Fewer extended tours, more local and civic appearances. A growing proportion of honorary engagements where the expectation was presence and warmth rather than the full physical commitment of a 90-minute concert performance. Howard was finding, by slow degrees, the middle ground his body had been requesting since 1991. A territory where he could still be Sir Howard, could still fill a room with the ease and connection his audiences had always come for, without the accumulated physical cost of a full touring show. But this recalibration was also a form of mourning, and anyone who knew Howard well enough to see the whole picture understood that. He had not been built for the partial offering. His entire performing identity was constructed around completeness, the full show, the total engagement, the understanding that an audience does not come merely to hear songs, but to be in the presence of someone who has committed everything to the room. Giving less, however medically necessary, was a diminishment that no warm reception could entirely compensate for. He gave what he could, and the audiences received it with the same love they had always shown. But between what he gave in those final years and what he had once given, there was a distance that only he could fully measure. He passed away in September of 2009, following a stroke. He was 74 years old. He had been ill in the weeks before, after returning from a trip to Rarotonga. New Zealand received the news in the way a country receives the loss of someone woven into the fabric of its communal life for half a century, with the particular grief that makes strangers pause and speak to one another, that fills radio programs with tributes and the songs everyone knows every word of. The loss was genuine, and the love was real, and the celebration of his life was entirely deserved. The contracts, however, are still somewhere in that filing system. The card with the medical instructions was somewhere in the pocket of a jacket that someone carefully folded away. The greenstone pendant was on his hand, or was not, depending on the memory of whoever was in the room in those final hours. And the booking diaries from the years immediately following his surgery, the diaries that, by some accounts, kept filling while the medical advice recommended the opposite, remained the largely undiscussed document of a system that some would say called its appetite devotion and called his compliance courage, without pausing to ask whether a man can freely choose to give what is being taken from him by every structure surrounding him. Howard Morrison gave New Zealand a particular kind of joy that no one who experienced it has entirely lost. He also gave something else, something never listed in any contract, never priced in any cancellation clause, never named in any tribute. He gave the applause what the applause demanded, across years and stages and hotel rooms and slow backstage recoveries. And the applause, being what applause is, never thought to ask what the cost was, because it never had to pay it. The industry that surrounded him, the booking culture that held him, the system of obligation that made saying no feel like saying something shameful. None of this was assembled with malice. It operated according to its own logic, which had very little internal mechanism for protecting its most beloved objects from the love that made them valuable. The danger was not the bad people. The danger was the good people, operating a system that had no honest place for the words, "Enough now. Let him rest." What would it take for an industry and a country to decide that the man inside the performance matters more than the performance itself? And is that a question we have yet to make ourselves truly answer? There was a woman who had known Howard Morrison for nearly 30 years before she finally agreed to sit in front of a camera and speak without the careful filter that loyalty had always required of her. She was not a lover, not a rival, not a figure from any scandal. She was something more difficult to categorize. A close professional confidant from the early touring years who had drifted to the edge of his circle as the 90s wore on, not through any falling out, but through the slow gravitational pull of a system that preferred its witnesses at a comfortable distance. For more than 2 decades, she had watched the public story of Howard Morrison's recovery and continued career told in the language of triumph, and for more than 2 decades she had said nothing that contradicted it. When she finally spoke, she did not speak in anger. She spoke in the measured, careful tone of someone who has rehearsed the truth so many times in private that delivering it publicly feels less like revelation than like setting down a weight that has been carried long enough. Her account does not destroy the legend, but it does something the legend has never done for itself. It tells the full story of what the legend cost the man who lived inside it. She said that Howard knew. He always knew. And that is the part that changes everything. She described a conversation that took place in the early part of the decade following his surgery. Not in a dressing room, not backstage, but in an ordinary domestic setting. A kitchen table, afternoon light, tea going cold in the cups the way tea does when the conversation becomes more important than the drinking. Howard had been quieter than usual that day, she said. In the particular way he was quiet when something had been sitting with him long enough to require words. He spoke about the operation not as a crisis survived, but as a reckoning understood. He said, and she repeated this carefully because she had turned the words over many times in the years since, that he had been given a very clear message by his body in the early 1990s, and that he had heard it, and that he had chosen to answer it in the only language he knew how to speak, which was the language of showing up. That phrase, the language of showing up, is the key that unlocks the moral complexity at the center of Howard Morrison's story. Because it was not denial, it was not bravado, it was not the performer's vanity refusing to acknowledge limitation. It was something more considered and more painful than any of those things. It was a man who understood the bargain completely, who had read the terms with full clarity, and who had decided, for reasons rooted in identity, in community, in the particular weight of what his presence meant to people who had very little else to hold on to, that the bargain was one he was willing to make. She asked him, at that kitchen table, whether he had ever told his doctors the full truth about how he was managing the touring schedule. He looked at her for a moment, with the expression she had seen on the hard nights, not quite a smile, not quite an apology, and said that his doctors were very good at their jobs, and that he was very good at his. She understood what that meant. She had always understood what that meant. And she sat with it in silence for a moment before changing the subject, because some truths, once named, do not require elaboration. They only require witness. For more than 20 years, she carried that conversation. She carried it through the tributes and the honors and the television retrospectives and the warm national grief of September 2009. She carried it because she had no framework in which to place it that would not have felt like betrayal of a man she genuinely loved. And she carries it still, she said, not as a burden exactly, but as a responsibility. The responsibility of someone who was trusted with the real version of a story that the world received only in its polished form. Was Howard Morrison a victim of the system that surrounded him? Or was he a man who made a sovereign choice that the system then exploited? And is there a version of that question that does not break your heart, regardless of how you answer it? The last major national honor ceremony Howard attended as a full participant, rather than a guest of tribute, was a civic event in Wellington in the middle years of the 2000s, a formal evening of the kind that New Zealand reserves for its most significant cultural figures, the kind where the room contains people who have spent their careers in the service of the country's public life and who understand, without needing it explained, the weight of what is being marked. Howard arrived in the jacket and the tie, the greenstone pendant visible at his lapel for the first time in some years at a public event, placed there with the deliberateness of a man who had decided that this particular evening warranted the full inventory of what mattered to him. People who were in that room described the quality of his presence that night as different from the performing presence they had known across 4 decades. Not diminished, that is the wrong word entirely. Distilled. As if the years of careful economy, the rationing of energy, the long discipline of giving the audience what it needed while holding back what the body could not afford, had produced in him a kind of concentrated authority that required no performance at all. He simply stood in the room, and the room organized itself around him, the way rooms had always done, but without the effort that had once been required to make it happen. The effort had been replaced by something else, something that looked, to the people watching, very much like peace. He spoke that evening about what New Zealand had given him, And the language he used was not the language of the stage. It was quieter and more specific. He spoke about Rotorua. He spoke about the people who had come to the early shows when the quartet was still finding its shape, the people who had laughed at the right moments and cried at the right moments, and made him understand that the connection between a performer and an audience is not a transaction, but a conversation, and that the conversation, once begun, carries obligations in both directions. He said that he had tried to honor his side of the conversation for as long as he had been given to do so. He said that he was grateful for every room that had let him in. The greenstone pendant caught the light when he moved, and the people who knew its history, the road company members, the old friends, the woman who would eventually sit before a camera and speak, understood that its presence at his lapel that night was not decoration. It was a statement. A private one, made in public, in the way that Howard Morrison had always made his most important statements, visible to everyone, fully understood only by the few. Afterward, in the quieter part of the evening, he sat with a small group of people he had known for decades, and was by all accounts entirely himself. The wit was present. The warmth was present. The particular quality of attention he gave to people in conversation, the quality that made each person feel they were the only one in the room, was present and undiminished. He asked about children and grandchildren. He remembered details from conversations years old. He made people laugh in the way that only Howard could make people laugh, with the timing of a man who had spent 60 years understanding exactly where the laughter lives in a sentence. But there was also, those who were there have said, a quality of farewell in the evening that nobody named aloud, because naming it would have required acknowledging something none of them were ready to acknowledge. Not a dramatic farewell, not a speech of endings, simply the quality that gathers around a person who has made a private reckoning with time and arrived at a place of acceptance that the people who love them have not yet reached. He was more present that evening than he had been in years, and the presence felt, to those paying attention, like a gift being given with full awareness that the giving was finite. The card was in his jacket pocket. It was always in his jacket pocket. And the greenstone was at his lapel. And the room was full of people who loved him. And Howard Morrison sat in the middle of all of it, and was, for one evening, simply and completely himself. Not the legend, not the national treasure, not the recovered patient performing health for an audience that needed to believe in it, but the man from Rotorua who had spent his life in conversation with the country, and who understood, better than anyone in that room, what the conversation had cost, and what it had given, and why, even knowing the full arithmetic, he would not have chosen differently. What does it mean to give everything freely, when the giving is also what is being taken from you? And is there a name for that kind of love that does not also contain the word loss? When the filing system of the management office that handled Howard Morrison's later career bookings was eventually consolidated and partially reviewed by people with legitimate professional reasons to examine it, what they found was not a smoking document. There was no single contract with a clause that could be pointed to as the instrument of harm. There was no memo, no letter, no recorded instruction that said, "Push him harder than his heart can manage." What there was, spread across dozens of ordinary booking instruments and correspondence files, was the accumulated portrait of a system that had never built into itself the mechanism for saying, "Stop." The fees were standard. The cancellation terms were standard. The travel arrangements were standard. The venue requirements were standard. Every individual document, reviewed in isolation, would have appeared entirely unremarkable to any entertainment industry professional. It was only when you laid them side by side, in chronological order, against the medical timeline of a man who had undergone heart surgery at some point and was managing ongoing cardiac conditions across the same years, that the portrait became something else. Something that looked, in the aggregate, like a system that had decided its own continuity was more important than the health of the person at its center. The figure who appears most consistently in the practical correspondence of those years, the name that recurs in the booking confirmations, the travel arrangements, the venue negotiations, the gentle letters to promoters explaining adjusted availability, is not a villain in any simple sense. The letters are professional and often warm. The adjustments, when they occur, are framed with evident care for Howard's well-being. There is no evidence of malice. There is evidence of something more complicated and in some ways more troubling than malice. The evidence of a person who had organized their professional identity so completely around Howard Morrison's continued performance that the alternative, the genuine, extended, medically appropriate rest, had become practically unthinkable. Not because they did not care, because they cared in a way that had become inseparable from the need for him to keep going. This is the shape of the betrayal that does not announce itself as betrayal. It wears the clothes of dedication. It speaks in the language of loyalty. It arrives at the dressing room door not with a threat, but with a schedule. And the schedule is presented as evidence of how much people need him. And the need is real. And Howard Morrison was constitutionally incapable of treating real need as something to be declined. The person who held that diary, who kept those bookings, who wrote those letters, they are not named here because naming them would be to assign to one individual a responsibility that belongs to a system. And because the people who loved Howard Morrison, and also, in their way, failed to protect him from the love that consumed him, deserve the same careful language that Howard himself would have used about them. He would not have named them as enemies. He would not have named them at all. He would have said, in the kitchen table voice, that everyone was doing what they knew how to do, and that the fault, if fault was the right word, lived in the architecture rather than the people inside it. What became of that architecture after Howard's passing is a question with a quiet answer. The office consolidated. The bookings ceased. The diary that had been kept full across the post-surgery years became a historical document rather than an active instrument. The person whose name recurs in its pages moved on to other work, other clients, other professional arrangements. There was no public accounting. There was no inquiry. There was no moment in which the system examined itself and asked whether the way it had operated around a man in Howard Morrison's condition was the way it should have operated. The tributes were generous and genuine. The retrospectives were warm. The national grief was real. And the filing system sat in its consolidated form, largely unexamined, containing the paper record of a bargain that everyone involved had preferred to call devotion. Is it possible to love someone and simultaneously be the instrument of their diminishment? And if it is possible, what does that tell us about the systems we build around the people we say we cannot afford to lose? In the weeks before Howard Morrison left for Rarotonga in the winter of 2009, he made a series of telephone calls to people he had known for a long time. Not unusual in itself, Howard had always been a man who maintained his connections with the deliberateness of someone who understood that relationships, like performances, require tending. But the people who received those calls have described them in the years since with a particular quality of attention, as if they understood retrospectively that the calls were something more than the ordinary maintenance of friendship. They were, in the way of a man who has made his private reckoning and arrived at acceptance, a form of completion. He asked about families. He told old stories with the pleasure of someone revisiting a favorite landscape. He laughed in the way that people who have known genuine difficulty laugh, not at the surface of things, but at the deep absurdity underneath them. The absurdity of a life that had been simultaneously extraordinary and entirely ordinary, full of the same loves and losses and stubborn misunderstandings that fill every life, just conducted at a volume the rest of the world could hear. To one person, a musician who had worked with him across 3 decades and who has spoken about the call with the careful precision of someone who knows they are describing something important. Howard said something that has stayed in the record of those final weeks as the closest thing to a direct acknowledgement of the bargain he had made. He said that he had been given more than he had any right to expect, and that he had tried to give back in proportion, and that he was not sure the proportions had always been right, but that he had done his best with what he understood at the time. He said it without self-pity and without drama, in the tone of a man completing an honest audit rather than seeking absolution. The musician said he did not know what to say in response, so he said what was true, that Howard had given more than anyone had a right to ask, and that the asking had sometimes been unreasonable, and that the people who had been in those rooms across all those years were better for having been there. Howard was quiet for a moment and then said, in the voice that had always known exactly where the meaning lived in a sentence, "Well, that will do then." He left for Rarotonga shortly after. He was not well when he returned. He passed away in September of 2009 and left this world at the age of 74 in the country he had spent his life in conversation with, surrounded by the people who had known him as a man rather than a monument. The green stone pendant was with him. The card, by then, had served its purpose in the only way such cards ultimately serve their purpose, as the private acknowledgement of a man who had understood his own mortality with clear eyes and chosen, every time the choice was available to him, to walk back into the light anyway. New Zealand paused in the way it pauses for very few. Radio programs filled with the songs everyone knew every word of. Strangers spoke to each other in the street. Older people sat with the particular grief of losing someone who had been part of the furniture of their emotional lives for so long that the absence felt structural. Not just the loss of a person, but the loss of a whole quality of warmth that had been present in the national atmosphere for half a century. The tributes were everything they should have been. The celebration of his life was genuine and deserved, and full of the laughter he would have wanted. The Maori community mourned one of its most significant cultural ambassadors. The entertainment industry mourned one of its most beloved figures. The country mourned the man who had made it feel, on hundreds of stages across 60 years, like a place worth singing about. And somewhere in the private grief of the people who had stood in the wings and handed him water and straightened his jacket and watched the hand against the ribs and driven him home in the silence after the adrenaline withdrew, somewhere in that grief, there was also the particular weight of witness. The weight of having seen the full picture and having carried it out of love and loyalty and the absence of any better option for longer than it should have been carried alone. The industry did not examine itself. The booking culture did not hold an inquiry. The system that had kept the diary full while questions about his health remained unanswered did not produce a report. The contracts remained in the filing system. The cancellation clauses remained standard. The next beloved entertainer with a health condition and a full calendar moved through the same architecture because the architecture had not changed, because the architecture had never been required to change, because the applause had always been loud enough to make the ticking underneath it easy to ignore. Howard Morrison's story is not a story about one man's courage, though it contains courage of a kind that deserves every word of admiration it has received. It is a story about what happens when a system built to extract performance from human beings encounters a human being who has been trained, by background and by decades of professional survival, to give more than the system has any right to ask. It is a story about the particular vulnerability of people who are loved publicly and protected privately not nearly enough. And it is a story about the gap between what we call devotion and what devotion, honestly examined, sometimes turns out to be. The heart that refused to stop beating did not refuse out of stubbornness or invincibility. It refused because the man it belonged to had decided, at a kitchen table with cold tea and afternoon light, that the language of showing up was the only language he knew how to speak. And the world received that language as a gift, and called it courage, and kept asking for more. The last thing the greenstone pendant touched was the warmth of the man who had carried it through every uncertain room. And then the room went quiet, and the applause, for once, had nothing left to ask of him. Friends, how do you feel about Howard Morrison? Was he a victim of the system that surrounded him, or did he make his own sovereign choice to give everything he had, right to the end? Was the industry that kept his diary full guilty of something that deserves a harder name than devotion? Or were the people around him simply doing what people do when they love someone and cannot imagine the world without them? Write your thoughts in the comments below. We genuinely want to know whether Howard Morrison is remembered in your city, in your family, in the songs that still play when the room needs warming. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the performers you have loved and what loving them may have cost them, then like this video for the truth it contains, and subscribe so that the next story finds you. Because there are more stories like this one. There always are, and they deserve to be told.